My name is Sarah Omar, and I'm assistant professor in Arabic and Islamic Studies here at Georgetown University. I'd like to welcome you to our series where you get to meet scholars and hear them discuss their intellectual journeys. My guest today is Dr. Alan Mikhail, professor of history at Yale University. Dr. Mikhail, welcome, and thank you so much for being with us today.
Thanks, Sarah.
So I'd like to start by having you tell us a little bit about yourself and what brought you to your areas of research.
Sure. So I entered college with an interest in sort of math and science. And I began taking those kinds of classes in my first year. And I noticed in the course catalog that there was a course on the history of the modern Arab world. And that intrigued me. I was born in the US to Egyptian parents who had come from Egypt in the 70s. We were always very closely connected to Egypt. Most of our family was there. We would visit, we'd get a newspaper every week, that sort of thing. And so I had a kind of personal interest. So I thought I'd just take this class and maybe learn something a little more official. It was a good class. I learned a lot. I didn't think much of it after that. I continued taking my kind of math science classes. I think in my second or third year, I sort of had a crisis of identity, what I was going to do with myself, which quickly turned into an intellectual crisis. And so I began taking all kinds of classes, French courses, religious studies classes, anthropology, more history. And I kept taking more and more history classes. I took lots of language classes, French and Arabic, and quickly came to realize that I really enjoyed studying the Middle East. And so when it came time to graduate, I thought, what am I going to do with myself? I thought law school at some point. I thought all kinds of things. But I decided to enter graduate school to study the Middle East because I thought this would be an opportunity to travel to the region, to live there, to continue studying Arabic, and also to start studying Turkish and Ottoman Turkish, which I was becoming interested in. And if I realized after a little bit that I didn't like this anymore, I could leave graduate school and that would be fine. So I went to graduate school and I quickly, sort of really fell in love with my studies, both studying the Middle East and studying history more generally. And developed intellectually. I'll just say at this point that when I was thinking about applying to graduate school, I got wonderful advice to apply to a history department rather than a Middle East studies or Islamic studies or Near Eastern studies kind of department, to be trained in the discipline of history. And I think that has been a part of my intellectual life ever since. Studying the Middle East, but first and foremost being a historian. And part of my intellectual work has been to have histories of the Middle East speak to wider issues in the field of history. So in graduate school, I became much more interested in the history of the Ottoman Empire, in the history of the Middle East in the early modern period. And as I studied more and more, I came to see that there was kind of a gap between histories of the Arab world in the early modern period and histories of the Ottoman Empire that didn't seem to really talk too much about the Arab world. Of course, there are exceptions in both those directions. So I wanted to really study that overlap of the Arab world and the Ottoman Empire, specifically in my case, Egypt, to think about what did 300 years of Ottoman history mean to Egypt, and what did Egypt mean to Ottoman history? So those were kind of the initial questions that I became interested in.
Well, wonderful. You've had a really productive and long career, and given the scope of your scholarship and your work, I'm wondering what type of questions have you been asking, and how have those questions changed over time?
Yeah. Well, one is the question I already referenced, how to make the Middle East speak to the wider field of history. I think we still have a lot of work as Middle East historians, as scholars of the Middle East in that regard. The other is to think seriously about the particular and the universal. So I've tackled that in multiple ways that I could get into in more detail later if you like. also trying to recover histories that either have been ignored, obfuscated, ideologically hidden for one reason or another. In my case, that meant histories of the 18th century, in the case of the Ottoman Empire, histories of the countryside, histories of the interactions between the Ottoman state and Egypt. More recently, it's meant ways in which the Ottoman Empire has impacted global history in very direct political ways. But both of those I see as sort of parts of the same piece of an intellectual agenda of how to have the Middle East speak to issues in global history, and then how to think about particular empirical histories in the largest scope possible. So a lot of my work in the first part of my career was in environmental history. And some of the questions that motivated me there were how was it that people in very, very rural parts of the Ottoman Empire in Egypt, places that might have only the most fragile connection to an urban center, how was it that you could see the Ottoman Empire from those places? What did the Ottoman Empire mean in those places? And how did those people enter into the bureaucratic thinking of the empire itself? So I became very interested in the ways that small scale infrastructure projects in rural parts of Egypt, in the Delta and in the south of Egypt, entered into Ottoman administrative work. And how was it that the Ottoman Empire was used by these rural places, and how did the Ottoman Empire also then galvanize economic resources, political resources, labor resources for the work of its own bureaucracy. So the questions there are both about understanding the countryside in very real ways, and then understanding something of the working of this, tri-continental empire. In my most recent book on Sultan Selim, the questions there are really thinking about how is it that this period of the life of this sultan intersected with some of the major kind of historiographical issues that early modern historians deal with, that being the connection between the Mediterranean and the Indian Ocean worlds, the opening up of the Atlantic for Europe and the Mediterranean, and thinking about the geopolitics of that period. So there are obviously very different stories and very different ways of getting at the history of the Middle East, but they all are engaged in this kind of work. I'll say also sort of, more directly, they're all interested again in the history of the Ottoman Empire in the Arab world. In the case of my earlier work in environmental history, I think that's very clear. In the case of Selim, he is the sultan who brings the Mamluk territories into the empire and really changes the character of the Ottoman Empire in ways that will shape it until its end in the 20th century. So that's kind of the beginning of the story of the Ottoman Empire in the Arab world, a story that I think sometimes falls between the cracks of Mamluk historians and Ottoman historians.
So given the types of questions that you've been asking, I'm wondering, how have your approaches to the texts or your approaches to your projects, how have those changed, and even the theories maybe that you've relied on as the field is also changing over time?
Yeah. When I was in graduate school, I would say we were kind of on a tail end of social history as method. And in the case of the Middle East in specific, kind of cultural histories of various kinds. Like for modern historians, cultural histories of nationalism. For early modern historians, cultural histories of consumption and those kinds of things. So that was happening, but you could sense that we were grasping for something new. At least that was my sense. At the same time, generally in the historical profession, questions of the global and what that meant were coming to the fore. So I think that my interest in environmental history represented those kinds of two things coming together. So a lot of the work is social history in a very real way. I read court records. I'm very interested in state inventories and how much things cost, and family relations, and small scale social history of understanding a place in a time. But again, putting it in a much wider casting to try to understand something of the global implications of what we might call small scale. So that was central to my approaches in thinking about environmental history. A kind of corollary of that was the development of the field of environmental history in Middle East studies. And I was doing work at the same time that several other scholars were doing similar kinds of things in thinking about environmental topics in the Middle East. I mean, there's been more and more of that work generated over the past decade and a half, let's say. And that's really exciting and has moved in all kinds of different directions. So I think that's a really important thing to think about in terms of approaches to the Middle East. I don't think that that this is a fundamental new paradigm that everybody will be working in a way that I think cultural history was for a moment at the end of the 90s, the beginning of the 2000s. But nevertheless, it's one of the major thrusts of the field at the moment. Global history is obviously still continuing in multiple kinds of ways. Historians approach global history through environmental history, intellectual history, the history of commodities, other kinds of economic histories, the histories of travel, those kinds of things. So that work is continuing, and it continues to inform how I think about my own writing, and also the work that I see amongst my own graduate students and other graduate students that students are really interested in thinking about what the global means. And I think that is a really good thing for us as a field, in the sense that I think it's important for historians of the Middle East to be obviously completely grounded in their sources and their languages and in the historiographies, but always to have one foot outside of the field, to be aware of what's going on in the wider historical profession, and again, to speak to those issues beyond just our own field. That's something that I have always tried to do, and that I encourage younger scholars and my own students to do as well. So in terms of approach, I think environmental history was one way of doing that kind of one foot in the Middle East, one foot out, thinking about particularities, but also universals. Work on thinking about the place of the Ottoman Empire around the turn of the 16th century in global history was another way of doing that. And there are all kinds of other ways. So, environmental history was sort of a means to an end for me to think about the Middle East and global history. The period of Sultan Selim was, again, a means to an end to think about the place of the Ottoman Empire in the Middle East in global history. And my next projects, which I'm not sure what they will be at this point, I imagine will try to do similar things.
Well, thank you so much for sharing your intellectual journey with us and your work. It's been really such a pleasure having you and having the opportunity to speak with you.
Thanks, Sarah.